Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our presentation on narrative therapy. My name is Tracy Wynn, and I'm joined by Lauren Pastrone and Sin McDonald. Narrative therapy is a collaborative and empowering approach to counseling that views individuals as authors of their own lives. In group settings, this therapy emphasizes creating a supportive space where members can share their stories, externalize their problems, and explore new, more empowering narratives. The group dynamic adds a unique layer as participants can witness and learn from each other's experiences, fostering connection and mutual support. We are excited to explore how narrative therapy works, its impact on groups, and innovative techniques that make it such a transformative approach. Let's dive in. Let's begin by discussing the key contributors to narrative therapy. Michael White and David Epstein are founders of this approach. Together, they developed narrative therapy in the 1980s as a collaborative and empowering method of therapy. They introduced concepts like externalization, which separate problems from people, and re-authoring, which allows clients to rewrite their personal stories. White and Epstein emphasize the importance of viewing clients as the experts in their own lives. Edward Bruner, a cultural anthropologist, greatly influenced the theory with his focus on storytelling as a way of making sense of our experiences. He showed that humans use stories to construct identity, and these stories can evolve over time. Bruner also pointed out the importance of cultural context, recognizing that our narratives are shaped by the environment we lived in. Clifford Geertz further contributed through his concept of thick description, which emphasizes understanding human actions within their cultural and social context. He highlighted how dominant cultural narratives influence personal experiences and identities, a central idea in narrative therapy. Other influences include Michael Foucault, who explored how societal norms and power dynamics shapes people's realities. Gregory Bateson's system thinking and Jerome Bruner work on narrative psychology also inform the approach. Together, these thinkers help shape narrative therapy into a framework that emphasizes personal empowerment and the deconstruction of oppressive narratives. Now let's examine the historical, cultural, and societal factors that shape narrative therapy. Historically, narrative therapy emerged in the 1980s as a reaction against problem-focused and pathologizing models of therapy, such as psychoanalysis and the medical model. During this time, postmodernism was gaining traction, and it challenged the idea of universal truths. Narrative therapy embraced this perspective, emphasizing the value of individual experiences and subjective realities. Culturally, narrative therapy recognizes that personal stories don't exist in a vacuum. They're deeply embedded in cultural norms and values. For example, societal narratives about gender, race, and success can shape how people view themselves and their problems. By exploring these cultural influences, therapists help clients understand how external forces contribute to their struggles. From a societal perspective, narrative therapy addresses systemic oppression and power imbalances. It challenges societal discourse that perpetuate racism, sexism, and classism by helping individuals deconstruct these dominant narratives. This approach is particularly effective for marginalized populations, as it encourages clients to reclaim their voices and rewrite the stories that have been shaped by oppressive systems. Ultimately, narrative therapy is a product of its time, rooted in growing awareness of social justice, cultural diversity, and the need for more inclusive and empowering approaches to therapy. Now let's talk about why narrative therapy was developed. One of the primary goals of narrative therapy is to empower clients, Traditional therapy models often pathologize individuals, labeling them as broken or deficient. Narrative therapy, on the other hand, views problems as external to the person, allowing clients to take a more empowered role in addressing them. This approach highlights the client's strength, resilience, and capacity for change. Another reason for developing this approach was to create more collaborative dynamic between therapists and clients. Narrative therapy moves away from traditional hierarchical therapist-client relationship. Instead, the therapist becomes a partner or a co-author in the process of rewriting the client's story. This fosters a sense of mutual respect and collaboration. Additionally, narrative therapy challenges the idea that problems are solely personal. It recognizes the influence of societal and cultural factors such as racism, gender roles, and economic inequality. By addressing these external forces, clients can better understand how their challenges are shaped by the world around them rather than seeing them as inherent flaws. And finally, narrative therapy was designed to be culturally sensitive and adaptable. Its emphasis on context and individuality makes it effective across diverse populations. By focusing on the client's unique experiences and values, it creates a therapeutic space that is inclusive and affirming. In summary, narrative therapy was developed to provide a client-centered, empowering, and social awareness framework for therapy, offering meaningful and alternative to traditional models.
So some of the basic key concepts to narrative therapy. People create multiple stories throughout their lives using dominant and local discourse. We can't remember everything that's happened to us, so we tend to focus on the dominant storyline, the story that's created through sociocultural practices and societal beliefs, which is our unconscious foundation of behavior, as well as those local non-mainstream behaviors or conscious behaviors and choices. The stories we have about our lives are created through linking certain events together in a particular sequence throughout our lives. Then we end up finding a way of making sense and explaining them. This explanation ends up forming the plot to our story, and then as we live our lives, we're constantly giving meaning to our experiences. This is also a strength-based approach, and when utilized through group therapy, group members can actually help analyze these stories that have been created to help reveal problems that have led to disempowering the individual. Central to narrative therapy is separating the person from the problem. By externalizing, distance is placed between the person and the problem, essentially meaning that the person is not defined by the problem. An example of this might be, instead of thinking Lauren is a worrier, where the problem is being internalized, narrative therapy would help rewrite this narrative to something more towards worry is following Lauren around. And then finally, changing the story can help change the emotional response by acknowledging that the problem is the actual issue and encouraging the explanation of the factors or the exploration of the factors involved. So how does it work? Narrative therapy helps break the story down, reconstruct it to reinforce a person's strengths and empower the individual. They use a language of change to revamp the way a client gives meaning to the distress, trauma, or pain of their stories with meaning reconstruction. Sense making helps form an understanding of our identity and our experiences. Paying attention to social context would be our interactions with others that shape our reality. Identifying subjective realities, which would highlight how the same experience can be perceived differently. And then through linguistic influences, language is key with narrative therapy, with the idea that language actually shapes our interpretations of an experience. Some terms and definitions associated with narrative therapy, there can be quite a lot and cause a very lengthy list. So I chose some of the more reoccurring ones that I noticed during my research. Dominant story, which is the personal narrative that's usually negative, which is deeply ingrained in a person based on societal influences, their life experiences, or personal beliefs. Alternative story is the new narrative that challenges the dominant story and highlights a person's values, strengths, and personal identity. Externalization, which you've heard me mention already, this is the ability to see the problem as separate from the person. Deconstruction, that's the task of breaking down the problematic or negative narratives into smaller bits and pieces so it can be addressed and understood little by little by both the therapist and the client. Mapping the influence, this is when a person can identify and explore the impact that a problem has had on their life. Reauthoring is where identifying strengths will come into play to help create a new life story with a more empowering preferred narrative. Co-authoring is where the therapist and the client actually work together to create an empowering story. And thin and thick descriptions. Thin descriptions are usually those basic details that are often found in the early stages of counseling. The "she's just difficult, I'm a little paranoid, it is what it is" type descriptors. And thick descriptions are those content-heavy, emotion-labeled, and nuanced details that come later after a rapport has been established, trust is in the room, and the work really starts to begin to be able to start reworking those personal narratives.
Hi, all. I'm Sim McDonald, and I'm going to be speaking about the role of the group leader when using narrative theory. This includes the leader's responsibilities and style, specific interventions that embody narrative theory, as well as how a group leader might apply interventions in a group setting. First, let's take a look at the leader responsibilities and style. The leader is going to seek to empower narrative facilitation. So what does this mean? This means creating an environment that fosters collaboration and support so that members can co-construct meaningful stories. In doing this, the leader creates a space that is culturally sensitive, non-judgmental, validates diverse perspectives, and more importantly, helps the clients to externalize problems from a personal identity. Finally, the leader seeks to encourage members to self-discover personal and communal resources and reauthor their narratives towards empowerment. Next is the specific interventions that are used in narrative theory. These interventions include externalization, so for example, giving the problem a name. External witnessing, an example of that might be highlighting moments of courage and resilience. Reauthoring, something like having the client tell a preferred future version of the story. Mapping influence. This is something like where the group could work together to diagram out different influences, such as social or cultural influences that are impacting or influencing the person and their relationships. Finally, we're going to talk about how the group leader applies interventions derived from this theory in practice. Application of intervention centers around externalization of problems, reauthoring stories, fostering peer collaboration, thickening preferred narratives, linking context, and encouraging reflection and insights. The group leader will focus on reflections to help clients formulate their own understandings of problems and solutions. They'll use change talk to revamp ways that clients attribute meaning to issues related to stress, trauma, or pain. And then they'll help facilitate clients to separate the problem from the person's identity. All of these different interventions have different applications in group, and each one can be used independently or together.
And here are our references. We have 2 pages. This is the first page and the second page.
That is the end of our presentation. On behalf of Tracy and Lauren, I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch our presentation on narrative theory. We look forward to our class discussion on this topic.